This video dives into 6 of the most intense and terrifying bear attack stories ever recorded, from a Kodiak bear ripping through a research vessel to a grizzly ambushing a graduation party. These jaw-dropping encounters reveal the raw power of nature's fiercest predators, from remote wilderness trails to once safe suburban zoos. The warm sun filtered through the birch trees as the small community gathered near the clearing. The air was filled with students' laughter and parents' proud eyes. In this remote village nestled deep in Ussuri-Krai, June 13th marked graduation's most important day of the year. Tables were set with food, speakers blared celebratory music, and banners hung between wooden posts. It was a rare moment of joy in an otherwise quiet, rugged life. Among the crowd stood Ivan Malenkov, a tall, broad-shouldered boy known for his quiet confidence and love of hiking. His best friend, Sergei, lean and sharp-eyed, had spent his childhood trapping and fishing with his grandfather. Mikhail, who dreamed of becoming a teacher, stood with his younger sister Daria, a gentle girl with long, dark hair and a shy demeanor. Always loud and full of life, Olga danced near the music stand, her bright red dress fluttering in the breeze. No one saw it coming. A massive Russian grizzly, shoulders high and eyes wild from the forest's edge, burst through the tree line. Its fur was dark and matted, a smear of blood on its left flank, hinting at a recent wound. It charged with terrifying speed, jaws open, driven by hunger and pain. The music still played momentarily as screams erupted, tables overturned, and children scattered. Ivan turned too late. The bear was on him in seconds, slamming him to the ground with a single paw. Its jaws clamped down on his neck with brutal force, tearing flesh and crushing bone in one horrifying moment. Ivan's legs twitched, then went still beneath the beast's weight. Blood soaked the grass. Olga had just started running when the bear turned, lunging toward her. It rose on its hind legs and came down with a thunderous swipe, its claws raking across her chest. She crumpled, gasping, her red dress now streaked with deep crimson. Sergei and Mikhail tried to flee together, but the bear closed the distance in seconds. It caught Sergei's arm, snapping bone as it bit down, then swung its head and flung him aside like a rag doll. Mikhail stumbled and fell, and the bear pounced on him with its full weight, crushing his ribs as it clawed and bit. The chaos around them drowned his cries. Daria, frozen in terror, ran to the nearest tree and crouched behind it, her hands pressed to her mouth to stop herself from screaming. But the bear's nose caught her scent. It turned, bloody fur glistening in the sun, and lumbered toward her. She pressed her back to the bark, but the animal reached around the tree, claws hooking her shoulder and dragging her into the open. It pinned her with one massive paw and clamped its jaws around her chest, shaking violently until she went limp. The clearing was a storm of horror. Parents screaming, children running, food and plastic chairs trampled beneath panicked feet. A few tried to throw objects or wave sticks, but the bear paid no mind. It had already killed 5 in under 2 minutes, its eyes wide and frenzied, its fur now drenched in blood. Someone fired a flare into the air, startling the beast. With a low, guttural growl, it turned and vanished back into the woods, crashing through the underbrush, leaving a trail of blood and torn foliage behind. The clearing fell into a stunned silence, broken only by sobs and distant, fading rustles from the forest. When rangers arrived an hour later, they found the area littered with debris and the bodies of 5 students. The bear had disappeared into the vast expanse of the taiga, but blood found on nearby branches confirmed it had been injured. A later investigation revealed that the animal had a deep bullet wound in its side, likely from an earlier encounter with poachers or a defensive shot that hadn't killed it. Agitated, starving, and in pain, it had followed the sound of music and the smell of meat into the village and unleashed its fury. Survivors stood in silence as the bodies were carried away. Though badly mauled, some witnesses had survived and would later describe the attack with hollow eyes and shaking hands. They said the bear didn't move like an animal. It drove like a storm, wild and unrelenting, filled with a kind of rage they couldn't understand. Their words haunted the community. The villagers, long accustomed to the dangers of the forest, had never experienced anything like this. The bear hadn't just attacked, it had slaughtered. Grief settled over the village like a heavy fog, and the place where the celebration had stood was now a scene of mourning. Flowers were laid in the grass, near the crushed chairs and trampled ribbons. Blood still stained the earth. There was no official explanation that could ease the pain. The authorities blamed the bear's aggression on its wound and the unnatural human noise and scent lure. But to those who had witnessed it, the cause didn't matter. What mattered were the 5 young lives lost in moments of unimaginable terror. The graduation stage was never rebuilt. The village held its ceremony indoors the next year, with the windows shut and the music low. No one dared to celebrate too loudly and return to that clearing again. The memory of that day lingered, not just in the empty seats at dinner tables or the framed photos on living room walls, but in the minds of every survivor who had watched the forest come alive with death. For years to come, the mere sound of rustling leaves or a low growl in the distance would be enough to send hearts racing and blood turning cold. The wilderness had always been near, always dangerous, but never before had it crossed that final line. Never before had it come straight into their joy and torn it apart in seconds. And even now, deep in the forest, the Russian Grizzly's trail remained hidden, lost beneath new growth and snowfall, as though the earth itself wanted to forget, but the village never would. Jake Hammond had fished Kodiak Island's backcountry for years, navigating the rugged coastlines and thick spruce forest with the quiet confidence of a seasoned hunter. At 42, he was strong, methodical, and disciplined, a man who knew how to move through bear country without being noticed. He had packed in solo for a week-long June trip, hoping to catch early kings along the river before the summer crowds arrived. But the fish hadn't shown up in numbers. The river was quiet, the air unusually still, and even the ravens kept their distance. On the 3rd morning, Jake hiked upstream past a long bend, his .338 rifle slung across his chest and bear spray clipped to his vest. The water shimmered in the early light, but the usual signs of life were missing. No jumping fish, no rustling of small game in the brush. The island felt wrong. As he approached a thick patch of alders, he paused to scan the dense green wall, years of instinct tightening his grip on the rifle. Then it happened. With an explosion of leaves and branches, a massive Kodiak bear crashed through the brush less than 15 yards away. It was huge, easily 1,500 pounds, its body wide as a truck grill, its fur soaked and tangled. The animal roared as it charged, foaming at its jaws, its eyes wild with desperation. Jake barely had time to shoulder his rifle before the bear was almost on him. He fired once, the shot slamming into the bear's upper chest. It didn't even slow down. The second round struck its shoulder, staggering it for a heartbeat. But it kept coming, snarling, blood and spit flying from its jaws as it lunged forward with horrifying power. Jake tried to backpedal, but slipped in the mud, landing hard on his back as the bear reached him. It struck with a paw the size of a dinner plate, the claws ripping through his jacket and raking across his left arm. The pain was instant and white-hot. He rolled, yelling, raising the rifle with his right hand, and fired a 3rd shot at point-blank range into the beast's ribcage. The bear roared in his face and bit down on his forearm, the pressure crushing bone and tearing flesh. Jake screamed as he jammed the barrel beneath the bear's chin and pulled the trigger again. The 4th shot tore through its jaw, and the bear reared back, blood spraying across the underbrush, but it still didn't fall. It swayed, bellowed, and rose on its hind legs, towering above him, its fur matted with blood, its rage undiminished. With trembling hands, Jake chambered his final round, bracing the rifle against his shoulder despite the pain shooting through his arm. As the bear lunged forward again, he squeezed the trigger one last time. The bullet struck just below the throat, punching deep into the heart. The bear let out a deep, wet grunt and staggered. Its momentum carried it forward a step, then another. Then it collapsed with a ground-shaking thud, twitching as its blood soaked the moss beneath it. Jake lay in the mud, gasping, his ears ringing, his arm torn and bleeding heavily. The stench of blood and gunpowder filled the air. He waited, eyes locked on the twitching bulk of the bear's body, until it stopped moving completely. Every breath felt like it scraped against broken ribs. He forced himself to sit up, cradling his mangled arm, trying not to scream. The pain was immense, but the adrenaline kept him moving. He stumbled back toward camp, following his trail, legs weak beneath him. His shirt was soaked with blood by the time he reached the tent. He dropped to his knees beside the radio and managed to send a mayday, voice hoarse and shaking. Hours later, the rescue team found him pale, shivering, and barely conscious. a blood trail leading back through the forest to the site of the attack. They found the bear, too, still where it had fallen, massive, scarred, and riddled with 5 bullet wounds. The rangers inspected the body and confirmed what Jake suspected. The animal had been starving. Its stomach was nearly empty, its gums infected, and its fat reserves dangerously low for early summer. The salmon hadn't come yet, and the bear had been dying slowly, painfully, and had finally snapped. The attack was logged as one of the most aggressive ever recorded on the island, and Jake's rifle, blood-stained and battered, was photographed alongside the carcass. No one questioned how close it had come to ending differently. Jake would have been torn apart if he had hesitated a second longer or missed even one shot. Surgeons saved his arm, but he lost much of its function. Deep scars ran from shoulder to wrist, and his right leg bore the marks of the bear's claws where it had pinned him to the ground. For months afterward, Jake couldn't sleep through the night. He would wake in the dark, drenched in sweat, heart racing at the sound of wind through the trees. He never hunted alone again. The experience changed him in ways he couldn't explain. It wasn't just the pain or the memory. It was the moment when he looked into the eyes of that wounded bear and saw something more than rage. He saw hunger, suffering, a kind of madness brought on by desperation. He had gone to Kodiak for peace, for solitude. Instead, he had walked into the path of a dying titan. Jake returned to the island with others in the following years, always wary and alert. He never bragged about the attack, never displayed the mounted claws or photos. He didn't need to. The scars spoke for themselves, and every time he heard branches snap behind him or found a fresh track in the mud, he remembered that day, the sound of paws pounding through the brush, the feel of teeth on bone, and the weight of a beast that had taken 5 rounds to bring down. Tom Walker had always chased solitude through speed, and mountain biking deep into British Columbia's wilderness gave him exactly that. Long, winding trails through untouched forest, where nothing existed but the sound of his tires and the whisper of wind through the trees. At 37, he was lean, strong, and experienced, having spent years tackling rough terrain across the Pacific Northwest. That June morning, the sun barely filtered through the tall canopy as he carved his way down a narrow trail that snaked along a ridgeline and dropped sharply into a thicket of ferns and underbrush. The descent was fast, and the forest around him was dense and still, filled only with the rush of tires on dirt and the rhythm of breath. He had seen no other riders for hours, his group spread out miles apart, but Tom didn't mind the isolation. He thrived in it, pushing himself harder with every twist of the trail, heart pounding, eyes fixed on the path ahead. Then everything changed in an instant. A thunderous crash burst from the brush to his left. Before he could react, a massive grizzly bear, fur dark with mud and thick with muscle, exploded from the undergrowth and slammed into him with the force of a car. The collision launched him off his bike and into the air. He hit the ground hard, the wind torn from his lungs, and before he could even cry out, the bear was on him. Its full weight crushed his body into the dirt, nearly breaking him in half. Massive jaws clamped around his ribcage, biting deep, cracking bone, and tearing through muscle like wet paper. Tom writhed beneath the animal, his arms flailing, trying to push its enormous head away. But the grizzly was too powerful and too determined, its body driven by hunger that drowned out all fear of humans. As Tom screamed, the bear raked its claws across his back, deep furrows opening in his flesh as blood sprayed into the grass. His legs kicked, boots striking the forest floor. But the bear only bit down harder, shaking him like prey, its teeth grinding through layers of skin and sinew. His vision blurred from pain, and he felt something snap deep inside his chest as the bear's weight shifted again, pinning him harder. The attack lasted only seconds, but each one stretched into agony. His hands clawed at the dirt, slick with blood, his body barely able to move as the bear mauled him with a terrifying mix of violence and desperation. His mind screamed to survive, but his body was failing, crushed, torn, broken. In the distance, the sound of other bikes suddenly skidded to a stop. Shouts filled the forest, panicked and sharp. The bear lifted its head, growling low, its breath hot and thick with the scent of blood. As the riders rushed toward the clearing, the bear snarled and swiped the air with one last furious burst before retreating into the trees, crashing through branches as it vanished into the wilderness. They found Tom collapsed in a pool of blood, limbs twisted, chest heaving shallowly. His eyes flickered open once, then closed again. The trauma was severe. Deep puncture wounds in his torso, shredded muscle across his back, and bone exposed in places where the bear's claws had torn straight through skin. One of the riders kept pressure on the worst of the wounds, while the others called for help, their hands slick with blood as they tried to hold his broken body together. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, earth, and iron. Every minute dragged while they waited for rescue. The sound of helicopters eventually broke through the canopy as emergency crews arrived. Paramedics worked frantically, administering fluids, dressing wounds, stabilizing what they could. But Tom had lost too much blood, and his injuries were far too severe. He was airlifted out, but died before they reached the hospital. Later, wildlife officials combed the area and determined the bear had been a large male, underweight for the season. The usual fish and berries were scarce, and it had likely been roaming closer to human trails in search of food. They found scattered remains of deer in the vicinity, along with signs of bear scat not far from the trail. Clear warnings that something had changed in the balance of the wild. The attack sent shockwaves through the local community. Tom had been well-liked and known for mentoring younger riders and sharing his maps and gear tips with anyone who asked. His death shook everyone who had ever trusted the trail, reminding them that in places this remote, speed and strength meant little when you crossed paths with something older, wilder, and more desperate than you could prepare for. Officials closed the trail temporarily and increased patrols, warning that bear encounters were rising across the province as food shortages pushed animals closer to human recreation zones. They posted signs and encouraged riders to travel in groups, carry deterrents, and stay alert. But the warnings felt small, almost hollow, for those who had seen what happened to Tom. Once a place of peace and exhilaration, the forest felt like it had teeth. Tom's funeral was held a week later, his bike placed beside his casket, scuffed and blood-stained. Friends and family gathered to remember his adventurous spirit, quiet confidence, and deep respect for nature. But in the silence that followed, no one could forget the violence that took him. The attack had come without warning, fast and final. A reminder that in the backcountry, even the most skilled and cautious could fall to something stronger, something no human could ever truly tame. And deep in that same forest, somewhere beyond the trail, the bear still roamed, driven by hunger, haunted by blood, and invisible until it chose not to be. Anna Petrov had spent the last 3 weeks anchored off the southern coast of Kodiak Island, collecting marine data with 2 other researchers aboard the Caution, a 40-foot research vessel fitted with sonar gear, sampling nets, and coolers packed with biological specimens. At 34, Anna was a seasoned marine biologist, disciplined, curious, and accustomed to the risks that came with remote fieldwork. That evening, the others had taken a skiff to the inlet to collect water samples, leaving her alone on the boat to catalog the latest catch and prepare data entries. The sea around her was calm, the fading sun casting soft gold over the shore's dark pines. Gulls circled overhead, and the low hum of the generator buzzed through the stillness. Anna was in the galley when a sharp noise snapped her head up, something heavy striking metal, once, then again. Louder, more forceful. She froze. It came from the lower deck, near the hull's side door, where the food stores were kept. Another crash echoed through the vessel, and then the unmistakable sound of hinges snapping under pressure. She rushed to the stairwell and peered down just as a massive dark shape shoved inside. A Kodiak bear, soaked from the swim. Fur slicked with seawater, forced its way through the splintered door frame and stepped into the passage, claws scraping against the deck. It moved with heavy urgency, nose twitching, drawn by the scent of stored fish and bait. Anna's heart pounded as she ducked back, searching for anything to block the stairwell. But before she could act, the bear surged forward, crashing through a metal storage shelf and tearing open a large cooler with a single swipe. Fish spilled out across the deck. The bear plunged its head down, devouring with violent hunger, muscles rippling as it fed. Anna turned to flee, but the bear caught movement and let out a deep roar that shook the walls. It lunged up the stairs, faster than its size suggested possible. Anna stumbled as she scrambled backward, reaching the main cabin just as the bear slammed into her. Its massive paw struck her side, sending her crashing into the wall. As she tried to rise, its jaws clamped around her forearm, teeth driving deep into muscle and bone. The pain was white-hot, but she fought through it, twisting with everything she had until the bear's grip loosened. She kicked at its snout, managed to slip away, and slammed the cabin door shut, jamming the lock with trembling fingers. The bear roared and pounded the door, but it held. Blood soaked her sleeve, and her arm throbbed with every heartbeat. She wrapped it with gauze from the first aid kit and slumped to the floor, breathing hard, listening as the bear began moving again. It stomped through the corridor, smashing shelves, knocking over equipment, and sniffing at every compartment. At one point, it paused outside the cabin, and she held her breath, terrified it might break through. But after a long, tense moment, it moved on, its footsteps heavy and slow. For 3 hours, Anna sat silently, unable to risk even a whisper. The bear remained aboard, circling the deck, ransacking coolers and clawing at cabinets. It shattered a porthole, leaving deep gashes in the steel with each swing of its claws. The Corsian creaked under the strain, tilting slightly where the hull had been damaged during the bear's entry. At last, near midnight, the boat grew quiet. Anna risked peeking through the tiny cabin window. She saw the dark shape lumber toward the rail. The bear paused, its wet fur glistening under the moonlight, then slipped overboard with a splash and swam toward the distant shore. Only once the water had gone still did she dare to leave the cabin, arms still bleeding and legs unsteady. When the others returned shortly after, they found the vessel in ruins. The galley was destroyed, equipment tossed across the deck, and the food supply torn apart. Anna stood pale and shaking, barely able to speak, her shirt soaked in blood and her eyes wide with shock. They wrapped her arm and radioed for an emergency evacuation. At the hospital, doctors treated the puncture wounds and set her fractured wrist, telling her the bite had missed major arteries by millimeters. She had lost significant blood, but they said she was lucky to be alive. Wildlife officials later confirmed what few had believed possible. A large male Kodiak bear, likely pushed to desperation by limited food availability, had swum from shore and boarded the anchored boat. The hull's broken seal and unsecured fish had drawn it directly aboard. News of the intrusion spread quickly across the scientific community. Experts were stunned by the bear's willingness to enter a vessel and how methodically it had searched and destroyed everything inside. It wasn't just curiosity. It had been hunger, raw and relentless, that drove the animal into what should have been foreign territory. Officials issued new warnings to all research teams operating near bear habitats, especially those storing biological samples or fish aboard. Overnight, securing food, locking compartments, and keeping doors reinforced became standard protocol. Researchers were urged to install bear-proof barriers on vessels, even at sea. For Anna, the scars were more than physical. She had dedicated her life to understanding marine systems, and the line between land and sea had always felt secure. That night, it blurred. The memory of claws scraping metal and the crushing pressure of teeth on her arm would not fade easily. She knew the bear hadn't been evil. It had been desperate, driven by a changing environment that gave it fewer options and made once unthinkable risks necessary for survival. Back in the lab, her colleagues often asked how she had stayed calm. She never had an answer, only a memory of holding her breath in the dark, her heart pounding as something ancient and massive prowled the halls of her floating world. And off the coast of Kodiak, the waters still rippled in the moonlight, hiding silent shadows beneath. The town of Nogliki, on Sakhalin Island's northern fringe, sat in silence most nights, especially after dusk, when the fog settled over the coastline, and even stray dogs stopped roaming. Inside the small police station, a concrete block building with peeling paint and rusted patrol cars out front, officers Igor, Maxim, and Roman settled into their routine watch. The three men had worked together for years, loyal to the job even in the quietest, most remote corner of Russia's far east. That evening, the cold air had crept in early, and the power flickered once or twice as the last light faded. They had no warning. It began with a low, scraping noise outside the station gates, then a metallic groan as the thin perimeter fence crumpled. The sound drew Igor to the window. What he saw didn't make sense. Dark fur, massive shoulders, breath fogging in the cold air. The figure moved with terrifying strength, pushing aside twisted metal as if it weighed nothing. A grizzly, huge and gaunt, muscles visible beneath matted fur, charged into the gravel courtyard with a roar that shattered the stillness. Roman ran to grab the emergency flare gun, while Maxim, closest to the entrance, bolted outside to try and divert it. The bear reared onto its hind legs, towering above the patrol cars, and smashed one of them with a violent swipe that caved in the windshield and bent the frame. Maxim fired the flare into the air, hoping to scare the bear off with light and noise, but it only enraged it. The bear turned on him instantly, surging forward with a roar that drowned out every other sound. Maxim raised his arm to shield himself, but the bear clamped its jaws around his shoulder, biting deep into bone and muscle. It dragged him backward, pawing at him, crushing him into the gravel. Blood pooled fast beneath him, and his screams echoed across the lot. Roman rushed out with the baton in hand, trying to draw the bear's attention, but the creature swung one paw and caught him across the ribs. The force hurled him backward into the station wall, where he crumpled to the ground, gasping, his chest heaving as blood spilled from a torn wound beneath his vest. Igor, still inside, slammed the main doors shut and jammed them with a metal rod. He backed away, heart pounding, ears ringing from the bear's roars and metal crashing outside. The surveillance monitors flickered with images of the courtyard, shadows of thrashing limbs, overturned vehicles, and motionless bodies. He radioed for help, his voice shaking as he relayed the unthinkable. A bear had stormed the station grounds. Officers were down, one unresponsive, another bleeding badly. Outside, the bear was still pacing. It clawed at the wrecked patrol cars, tore open a tool chest, and shoved its snout into a garbage bin near the sidewall. It was desperate, starving, and wildly aggressive. Broken fence segments hung in twisted arcs behind it, and the wind carried the scent of blood and fuel through the compound. Maxim lay in the open, unmoving now, his body broken where the bear had left it. Roman was alive but fading, each breath a struggle as he tried to crawl toward the main doors, one hand clutching his side, the other dragging against the gravel. Igor couldn't go outside. He had no weapon strong enough to stop something that size. The emergency rifle had been transferred out weeks earlier for maintenance and never returned. He could only wait and watch the monitors helplessly, hoping help would come in time. It took nearly an hour before the wildlife rangers arrived. 3 men armed with tranquilizer rifles, coming in an unmarked truck, tires crunching slowly as they approached the station's battered perimeter. The bear saw them and backed away from the smashed vehicles, roaring once more before lunging toward the sound of the engine. The rangers didn't hesitate. They fired 2 rounds, one striking the bear's flank, the other embedding near its neck. The bear staggered, swung mindlessly, then turned in a wide looping circle before collapsing with a heavy thud. Igor opened the doors only when the rangers confirmed the bear was down and sedated. He rushed to Roman, who was barely conscious, skin pale and lips blue from shock and blood loss. They loaded him into the back of the ranger's truck, pressing gauze to his ribs, shouting to keep him awake. Maxim was gone, his injuries too severe, blood already dried across his uniform and face. Locked in pain. News of the attack spread fast. The image of a grizzly bear storming a police station courtyard shook the entire community. Wildlife officials examined the bear and found signs of prolonged starvation. Its stomach was empty, ribs prominent, paws cut from foraging through trash and fencing. With salmon runs weakened by poor spring conditions and deep snow pushing wildlife closer to human settlements, bears had become bolder, more aggressive, and increasingly desperate. Locals erected stronger fences around homes and public buildings. Rangers increased patrols, and government officials promised emergency food drops in the northern forest zones to reduce bear migration into populated areas. But none of that changed what had happened that night in the yard of a police station, where a predator, wild and starving, had shattered the illusion of safety in a place meant to uphold it. Igor returned to duty 2 weeks later, silent and hardened. Roman survived after multiple surgeries and a long recovery. Maxim was buried in a ceremony that drew hundreds from across the region, a final farewell to a man who faced death without hesitation. His name was carved into a stone, beneath a new reinforced gate and watchlight, outside the station. The fence was rebuilt with steel posts and concrete foundations, but the marks the bears had left, claw scars in the wall, twisted metal near the patrol cars, remained. No one painted over them. They were a reminder, visible every day, of what hunger could do, and how even the most remote corner of Sakhalin was no longer beyond the reach of the wild. The morning at Cedar Grove Zoo began like any other, early light filtering through trees, the scent of damp straw and clean hay rising from the enclosures, and a quiet stillness broken only by the soft calls of animals waking up. One of the senior keepers, Maya, moved with practiced efficiency through her rounds. At 29, she had worked at the zoo for nearly a decade, known for her steady presence and strong bond with the animals, especially the large carnivores. That morning, She carried her toolkit, a checklist, and a radio clipped to her hip, heading toward the brown bear habitat near the northern edge of the zoo. The bear, an adult male named Kuzma, had been at Cedar Grove for years. Maya had worked with him closely since his arrival, and while he was unpredictable at times, he had never shown real aggression toward the staff. She approached the enclosure from the side service path, noting that the bear was pacing near the far wall. It wasn't unusual behavior, but there was something different about the way he moved. His gait was uneven, and his ears were pinned back. Still, there were tasks to complete. The outer barrier had been flagged the day before for a maintenance check, and Maya needed to inspect the latch system and surrounding mesh before feeding. As she approached the door, she glanced toward the security cam. Green light on, no alerts. Everything seemingly in order. She bent to examine the latch when a deep, guttural sound broke through the air. It wasn't the bear's usual low grumble. It was sharper, more forceful. Maya looked up just in time to see Kuzma charging from across the enclosure, massive paws tearing up the ground, eyes wide with rage. In a split second, the bear slammed into the barrier, and with a sickening metallic crunch, one of the old support hinges gave way. The door buckled inward enough for Kuzma to drive his paw through the opening. His claws tore through Maya's jacket and sank deep into her shoulder and ribcage. The impact knocked her backward onto the concrete path, pain exploding through her side as the bear yanked its limb back, shredding cloth and skin. Maya's mind blurred with panic, but her body moved. She scrambled across the ground, one arm clutching her torn side, while the other reached blindly for anything nearby. Her hand closed around a long metal pole used to test gate locks. As Kuzma slammed the door again, trying to widen the gap, she thrust the pole into the space, blocking the opening just as his snout pushed through. He roared furiously, swiping again, but the pole held momentarily, giving her seconds to retreat. Blood streamed from her wounds as she stumbled backward along the path, slipping on gravel, trying to reach the alarm switch fixed to the outer wall. Each step was agony. Her left arm hung limp, and her breathing was ragged from the pain in her ribs. Behind her, the bear continued battering the barrier, shaking the frame, roaring loud enough that birds scattered from nearby trees. The emergency klaxon sounded within seconds of Maya's hand slamming the switch. Across the zoo, staff dropped what they were doing and sprinted toward the bear compound. 2 security guards arrived first, carrying air horns and noisemakers, followed by a keeper with a tranquilizer rifle. The coordinated noise barrage began instantly. Blaring alarms, shouted commands, and the echo of clanging poles filled the air. Kuzma hesitated, pulled back from the breach, then roared one final time before retreating deeper into the enclosure. His body heaved with each breath, blood visible on his claws. Maya collapsed near the corner of the wall, too weak to stay upright. Her breathing was shallow, her skin pale beneath streaks of blood and dust. Staff reached her within seconds, applying pressure to her wounds, stabilizing her shoulder, and keeping her conscious until paramedics arrived. The injuries were serious. Deep lacerations across her shoulder, puncture wounds along her ribs, and heavy blood loss. But she was alive. The investigation began hours after the bear was fully sedated and locked away. Surveillance footage confirmed the incident had lasted less than 2 minutes from the first impact to the final alarm. Zoo officials examined the enclosure door and found that the support bracket had rusted through beneath its outer layer of paint, a weakness missed during the last inspection. More troubling was the discovery that Kuzma had been limping for several days, an untreated leg injury from unknown causes, possibly worsened by agitation and pain. Compounding the problem, a food delivery delay had disrupted his feeding schedule, leaving him stressed and likely in a heightened state of aggression. The combination of untreated injury, hunger, and a structural failure created the perfect storm. For Maya, the days following the attack passed in a haze of surgery and slow recovery. Doctors repaired the muscle damage in her shoulder, cleaned the deep puncture wounds, and wrapped her ribs in tight bandages to ease the pain of every breath. She spent a week in the hospital, another 2 in physical therapy, and though the physical scars would remain, she insisted on returning to the zoo. The attack sent shockwaves through the staff and the wider zoological community. New protocols were issued across the park. Every enclosure underwent full inspections. Feeding systems were upgraded with remote delivery chutes, and emergency response drills were intensified. The bond between keepers and animals had always been built on trust, but the incident reminded everyone that instinct and nature could override even the deepest familiarity. Maya eventually returned to Cedar Grove as a survivor, not as a warning. Weeks later, she stood near Kuzma's enclosure again, still bandaged, watching from a secure platform as he slept in the shade of a tree, finally calm again. The danger had come without warning, fast and feral, but she had survived. And in doing so, she had changed the way the zoo approached its work forever.